Welcome to Strip Cover Lit, where we squeeze the bigger picture out of literature. I am Adrian Fort, and we're here for another poetry discussion that comes to us, of course, from the hallowed pages of Emily Dickinson. The poem in question is one that I have not spent very much time with, but was requested. And it's a poem that I think I have a new understanding with. The poem in question is titled, God Gave a Loaf to Every Bird. It reads as such. God gave a loaf to every bird, but just a crumb to me. I dare not eat it, though I starve, my poignant luxury. To own it, touch it, prove the feat that made the pellet mine, too happy for my sparrow's chance, for ampler coveting. It might be famine all around, I could not miss an ear, such plenty smiles upon my board, my garner shows so fair. I wonder how the rich may feel, an Indiaman, an earl. I deem that I, with but a crumb, am sovereign of them all. So, one of the things, if you look up this poem, if you look to see what people say about this poem, one of the things that you will find about this poem is that this poem is often given sort of a lovey-dovey interpretation. How wonderful this poem is, how sweet, how saccharine. Often the interpretation is given to this poem that our speaker might be poor in some way, but with this providence provided by God, this bit of sustenance provided by God, our speaker is more wealthy than royalty. I think that's a short-sighted interpretation of this poem. I think what Emily is doing here is a bit more crusty than that. I think that what Emily is doing here is a bit more underhanded than that. I think what Emily is doing here is a lot more subversive than it would appear off the top. In fact, that's not fair. Is every bit as subversive as it would appear off the top if we pay attention to the words involved. So, in order to get a different grasp of this poem than that which is often allowed purchase, let's take a step back. So for a lot of people, and I'm not issuing this as judgment, I'm not issuing this as sort of condemnation. For a lot of people, the minute the word God is thrown in, the entire interpretation of the poem has to go a specific way. The minute that word is thrown in, the invocation of God, the accusation of God, the minute that is thrown in, there has to be a positive light cast on what the God character is doing. I don't think that's necessary when reading Emily Dickinson. I don't think there is a whole lot of I don't think there's a whole lot to back you up when making that claim. So, let's remove God from the equation, just to get a different reading on the poem, to get a less contentious reading of the poem. Let's replace God with Dad, okay? Let's replace God with Dad. Let's replace bread with love. So, at this point, and birds are siblings, right? This is the rest of the family. Dad gave love to all of us siblings, but just a little bit to me. I dare not feel this love. I dare not consume this love, though I am starving and cast out from what love is to have. This is my poignant luxury. I think that already we're seeing a little bit of a different light here. I think that already what we're forced to do when assuming that there is a core metaphor in this poem, that this is not simply words written to be read on the nose, to be interpreted on the nose, to be deciphered one for one by a reader. I think that once we allow for that, and look, maybe this poem was supposed to be read as God praising. Okay. Well, where's the fun in that? Where's the fun in reading a poem as it was intended to be read? So, if we take that step back, and we replace God with dad, and we replace bread with love, and we replace birds with siblings, what we have here is someone cherishing the chip on their shoulder. That sounds a lot more like the Emily Dickinson that I have come to know and love through decades now of reading her poetry. And when we jump forward to the final stanza, I wonder how the rich might feel, an Indiaman, an earl. I deem that I, with this massive chip on my shoulder, am sovereign of them all. Does that or does that not make a little bit of a different impact than saying, look, I got just a little bit of love from God, okay? I don't have as much love from God as the Indiaman, as the earl. I don't have all that much love from God that they do. But the love is still enough. The love to me is still enough. That I have more than they do. Because I am able to cherish said love from God instead of consuming it. That persnickety nature, if this is a valid interpretation, I think it's a valid interpretation whether it's what was intended or not. That's how I feel about literature in general. But to read this poem as being grateful that the idea of misfortune is not buried in this poem, is not buried in that opening stanza. It's right out there for us to see. It is intended, however we accept that misfortune, it is intended for us as the reader to acknowledge it. For me, I think that one of the things that is so often concerning about literary criticism is that someone offers up something that seems, oh, okay, yeah, that'll pass. And it's just poem 791 from Emily Dickinson. So the poem's about, being grateful to God and yada, yada. That's where we're at here. That's where we're going. That's what it's about. Okay, then I'm going to write my paper that, yeah, this is what it's about. This is what's going on here. That's what we've got. And the next person comes along and sees, oh, well, there's two scholarly articles about this poem, and they both say this same thing. But the very second line of this poem, but just a crumb to me. For someone as intense, I think, as we have to imagine Emily Dickinson, the idea of ideas providing sustenance, the idea of an inherent difference, because in this poem, it is not something our speaker has done that has garnered lesser than. It is the actions here of God. They are the actions here of God. So allowing for this inherited difference from others, someone that we're forced to imagine as intense as was Emily Dickinson. Ideas are one hell of a thing. Very powerful. For someone to be able to write all of the poems and go all of the places with them that Emily Dickinson had, there is no doubt that she had a Hemi up there in her brain. And when she turned that ignition, that baby purred for a long time. And I think when people are as extreme as we almost have to accept Emily Dickinson to have been, oftentimes the communication is missed. Oftentimes those things that they say and those things that they mean are clearly one and the same to them, but they lose a lot of that communicative effect when other people are brought in. One of the very easy ways to see this, pull up YouTube, search David Goggins, search Kobe Bryant, search, now I'm on basketball players, Michael Jordan. When Michael Jordan, in that now meme-worthy interview about the Bulls, said, and I took that personally, that means something to you and I. Certainly it does not mean the same thing to you and I that it did to Michael Jordan. You search up Kobe Bryant, and there's a viral interview of him on one of those, I don't know the late night guys from each other. I just don't. I don't care to. But Kobe Bryant had just retired, and the Lakers stunk. And they just won a game, the Lakers did. And they gave an interview after the game, and they were all clowns. Just, we're back, and clowning on one another and being goofy. And it cuts back to Kobe Bryant. And he's just sitting there with this angry face. And the late night TV guy asked him, if you were still on the Lakers, would this be happening? Kobe Bryant, at least in the viral portion of the interview, didn't even answer. He just gives him a mean look. That communicates something to you and I. That's someone being a weirdo, right? That's why we laugh. That's why it goes viral. But Kobe Bryant, a year removed from his team, couldn't even see that clip and remain a normal person. David Goggins just says wild stuff. Just says all this wild stuff. And he's gone viral because in little bits and pieces, the motivated among us can grab on to one of these things that he says and pull ourselves up and reach out and grab another one of these things and pull ourselves closer to being fit to our academic goals, to whatever it is that we're trying to do. But a big part of the reason that he's gone so viral is that so instead of listening to David Goggins while you're at the gym, listen to him while you're brushing your teeth. See what effect it has then, right? Listen to him at lunch with your significant other. Say, hey babe, let me pull up this video for us to eat lunch by. And it's David Goggins on a 100-mile run cursing at you. Much different then, isn't it? So I think with Emily Dickinson, oftentimes there are these little phrases. God gave a loaf to every bird. Hope is the thing with feathers. These little things, there's a certain slant of light that sound sort of sing-song. I'm nobody. Who are you? Are you nobody too? Then there's a pair of us. Shh, don't tell. But if you allow those most inner fears, those most hidden desires, those deepest longings of the human experience, you allow those things into these interpretations, not because we must, not because just they're on the page, but we allow them in because when we're reading Emily Dickinson, it's like listening to David Goggins at the gym. If you're doing it in the right place to read Emily Dickinson is as a different type of person. The right way to read Emily Dickinson is searching for those deeper truths. Otherwise, all you're doing is hopping onto a full-speed treadmill when you haven't even done your warm-ups. You're going to hit it and go, baby. Nothing's going to stick. None of it's going to make sense. It's all just going to be weird words. And I think a lot of the interpretations, a lot of the Sing-Songy interpretations are that way. So just listen to this opening stanza one more time. God gave a loaf to every bird, but just a crumb to me. I dare not eat it, though I starve. My poignant luxury. Where's the workaday interpretation to that? Where is the little ingot of normalcy in this poem? You have to search around and look for something to be able to say, okay, a regular interpretation of this poem is fine. Robert Frost, I took the road less traveled by. That poet and that poem team up to give you a message that could be found inside a Hallmark card. Now, I think it's deeper than that. I think that there's more going on than many people would allow. I think that it is not quite everything that your 7th grade English teacher told you. I think there's more there than that. Bluebird by Charles Bukowski. That poet and that poem allows you an interpretation which is self-effacing and which is able to be incorporated into your daily life. The way that Emily Dickinson works is, I think, much different than that. I think when you find yourself in Emily Dickinson, and again, one of the reasons I think this is because earlier in this book, not so much. The earlier poems in this book are sort of poems which might be written and interpreted to something which is sort of regular. And when I say regular, this is not to demean, for example, the Charles Bukowskis of the world. I think that every Bukowski poem is able to be interpreted and incorporated into life in a regular sort of way. I think that reading Emily Dickinson is something closer akin to a normal person as listening to a lecture on astrophysics. I'm not going to be able to do anything with that in my life. But when I'm able to pluck things out of it, it's really interesting. And I feel different at the end. Reading A Brief History of Time. I'm not going to my overnight job at the Five and Dime and able to incorporate the space-time continuum. I'm just not. But it changes my perspective on life to be able to read it. I think Emily Dickinson is literature in this same vein. I think that Emily Dickinson operates on a plane which does not allow the self to relax. I think Emily Dickinson operates on a plane that forces us to contemplate those things which we had taken for granted, including language itself. Otherwise, piss off. Otherwise, don't bother. You're not going to casually read A Brief History of Time. You've got to take notes. You've got to highlight. You've got to think about this stuff. Because the moment, and the first 2 times that I read that book, this is what happened to me. There's so much going on that what happens is your eyes follow along the page and your brain says, hey man, kind of hungry. Haven't had Taco Bell in a while. I really like that Baja Blast they've got out there. You will read the poem and your brain will stop doing, or you will, in this case the poem, but you will read the book and your brain will stop doing the work. And you'll say, okay, I didn't get anything out of that paragraph. I've got to go back and reread it. And you'll remember the words. The words won't be connected to anything in here. Emily Dickinson is that same way. Emily Dickinson operates on that same plane. There are so many things going on that it is possible to read the Emily Dickinson poem, however short it is. Didn't write epics, Emily didn't. And your eyes will start tracing the words, and you'll remember them when you reread it. And you'll have to reread it because those words aren't connected to images, which aren't connected to ideas. And Emily Dickinson, from time to time, so you've got words which connect to images, which connect to ideas. God, G-O-D, connects to an image of God and what that thing stands for. And then you've got the ideas of what's happening to incorporate that G-O-D, that B-I-R-D, that C-R-U-M-B. And Emily Dickinson necessitates all of those levels. That's all I have for this poetry discussion. If you like this sort of thing, it helps me out here on the channel if you hit that like button. I really hope to have you back for the next poetry discussion that I have here. I do poetry reviews, I do short story discussions, I do short story reviews, I do opening paragraph discussions, I do writer's quotes, I do novel read-alongs, all that stuff here on the channel. So if you're here by chance but not designed, consider hitting that subscribe button as well.